Hello and welcome to this Infrastructure Victoria webinar, where we're going to be looking at trains, buses, cycling, all of the recommendations that we've got in Victoria's infrastructure strategy that relate to public and active transport. I'm Jonathan Spear and I'm CEO of Infrastructure Victoria, and thank you very much for joining us today. When we were doing the update to the Victoria's infrastructure strategy, we were told by lots of Victorians that they wanted more travel opportunities and more choices about how they undertake those millions of trips every day that happen across Victoria. And so that's what this webinar today is going to dive into. The other thing that we heard from many of you when we presented the whole of the strategy when it was released in November is that you would like to have a bit of a deep dive into more areas of the strategy. And so I said to the team, let's give the people what they want. And so that's what we're doing today. We're going to do a deep dive into public and active transport recommendations in the strategy. And to do that, I'm joined by some fantastic fellow panelists. So I have with me my colleague Matthew Reisbach, who's a principal transport planner at Infrastructure Victoria and has led lots of the work that we're going to be talking about today. I'm also really pleased to have Alison McCormack from Bicycle Network. And so she leads Bicycle Network's advocacy and fantastic programs and some pretty cool rides around the state as well. Isn't that right, Alison?
Yes.
And we've also got Tony Morton here, who's president of the Public Transport Users Association. So thanks for joining us, Tony and Alison. You're going to be hearing from them in the second half of the webinar. We've had lots of questions that many of you have put through in the Slido app that you can see at the bottom of your screen. And so that's been open prior to the webinar. So thank you for those of you who've already given us some questions. You can put in additional questions, or you can vote up questions that you'd like us to sort of talk about in the second half of the webinar, and we're going to get to as many of those questions as we can, with a real focus on the ones that sort of touch on the themes and the recommendations in the strategy. So what I'll like to really do before we proceed any further, of course, is acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting. For this webinar, I'm at Infrastructure Victoria's office in Melbourne, so I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners here on the lands that we are based, and pay my acknowledgements to elders past and present and any who might be joining us, and of course acknowledge that infrastructure all across the state has been built on land that's been managed by Aboriginal people for thousands of years. What we'd like to, of course, do next is give you a bit of an overview of what the key elements of the strategy are before we dive into the particular recommendations. So just a bit of a reminder, many of you are probably familiar that Infrastructure Victoria is the state's independent infrastructure advisor. And we've been proudly performing that role for over 10 years now. We do three main things: a 30-year infrastructure strategy that we're going to be focusing on today, and this is the third time we've delivered that strategy. But we also give independent advice to government and undertake research that's really designed to inform policy and investment making decisions. And many of the recommendations that we're going to talk about today in relation to things like bus reform or cycling network improvements are underpinned by deep research that we've previously published. If we go to the next slide now, what we'll see is a quick summary of the whole of the strategy. So the 2025 version of the infrastructure strategy makes 45 recommendations to the Victorian Government. And that covers all sorts of different sectors, but these are recommendations that we are saying to Victorian Government should be started in the next 5 years to set us up really well for the next 30 years. In addition, we identified 8 future options for the government to think about. These are things that don't necessarily have to be started in the next 5 years, but we should be beginning to plan for them and consider them because we're likely to need them, either projects or policy reforms, over the coming decades. And when my colleague Matthew goes through the recommendations shortly, you'll see how examples of both recommendations and some of these future options we've identified. Now, there's lots of technical analysis that underpins all this work, and we publish all of that on our website for everybody to see. So if you want to see all the economic modelling and demand modelling and so forth, knock yourselves out. It's all there to find on our website. But in addition to that, these recommendations are based on lots of community engagement and hundreds of submissions that we received, including from organisations like you who are joining us today. And all of that led to a much better version of the final strategy that was tabled in Parliament in November of last year, and included new recommendations and new options being identified, including in the transport and active transport and public transport areas. So with that, I'd just like to go to the next slide and just remind everybody that if you'd like to dive deeper into any of the recommendations we're talking about today, then our strategy has been designed to be accessed really easily through our website. So you can intuitively explore any topic you're interested in, like transport or regional Victoria or Melbourne or other things like energy transition through the website. You can search by recommendations, and there's lots of interactive maps and so forth, especially for the transport recommendations we're going to talk about today. So if you haven't been on the Infrastructure Victoria website, I'd really encourage you to do that, to dive in deeply and understand those recommendations that you're most interested in. With that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Matt, who's going to take you through a summary of the public and active transport recommendations, and really looking forward to then coming back as we talk with Alison and Tony about their thoughts on these recommendations and your questions. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Jonathan. Lovely to have so many people join us here today. I'm going to kick off with the public transport recommendations. So we've got 10 of those to go through. Then I'll move on to the active transport ones. So heading to the first of our public transport recommendations, that's around making government infrastructure more accessible. Many of us have been on the suburban tram network and at the stops that we have, and you'll see that we need to take some giant leaps to often get on board those trams. That's quite difficult for those with no disabilities, but for the 1 million Victorians with a disability, that is a massive barrier to using our tram network. Those barriers exist on our other forms of public transport as well, and our government buildings. For public transport, the government has missed deadlines in the need to provide the upgrades to the tram stops that are needed to make the network more accessible. Around a third to a half of bus stops are inaccessible, and 70% of tram stops are inaccessible. When we have level access tram stops, it allows more people to use the services that we already have, but we also have a massive reduction in incidents between cars or trams and people, and that goes down about 80% where there's a level access stop. So we've recommended to the Victorian Government to spend 1.5 billion over the next 10 years to upgrade those stops and make the network more accessible. In the next of our recommendations around the tram network is extending that network to encourage more homes nearby. The government has a target to get over 800,000 new homes in metropolitan areas and across the state over the next decade. That focuses on places where there's jobs, services, schools nearby. Some of those opportunities exist on Melbourne's tram network. Some parts of that same network are quite crowded at the moment. Therefore, as part of this recommendation, we've called on the Victorian Government to increase services, about 300 weekly, on routes that are quite busy, such as Route 86, 96 and 109. We've also said as part of that recommendation to the Victorian Government to increase nighttime and weekend services across the network to encourage those people that live on the tram network to travel by tram rather than by car. It also means that new developments are less likely to need car parking spaces. In terms of the extensions to the network, we've recommended the Victorian Government do some detailed work and assessment, a whole series of tram network extensions. As you can see from the map on the right, we've highlighted quite a number of those. Two of the routes are in the Arden precinct, two of the routes are in the Fisherman's Bend precinct, and 4 routes across suburban Melbourne in places like Burwood, Chadstone, Coburg and Moorabbin. Some of these changes and extensions would work well with other parts of network reform, so we'd encourage that as well. This delivers quite good value to the state. We've done some appraisal on that, where we get or see a return of $1.90 for each dollar invested for the suburban tram extensions, and for places like Fisherman's Bend, that could be up to $3.10 for every dollar invested. We've also looked more into the medium term, so from the mid-2030s onwards, and called on the government to look at extensions from Airport West to Melbourne Airport and from Sunshine to High Point to do some of those suburban connections. Each of these route extensions varies in length and therefore cost, but we've estimated between 200 and 900 million per extension. On to the next recommendation we have around running faster bus services more often in Victoria's largest cities. Around a third of people have never used a bus. Are you one of them? I wonder whether that's because many of our bus services hasn't changed since they've been first implemented. And that puts big constraint on the network, given Melbourne and Victoria has evolved quite significantly over time. We've recommended to the Victorian Government to take a whole lot of reforms around the bus network to support the high usage of it. And we're calling on, as part of this recommendation, that 80% of people within Melbourne, Ballarat, Geelong and Bendigo live within a bus service that runs every 20 minutes or better. Also, we've called on for some key activity centres to run even higher frequencies, so maybe every 5 to 10 minutes. In growth areas, we've suggested adding routes as well as reforming routes. Across the network, our community research has shown that people value buses that start early and run later, say between 6 a.m. and 11 p.m. daily. And people want routes that are easy to follow, so they follow arterial roads and main roads rather than diverting off back streets all the time. In terms of the cost of this recommendation, the annual increase we estimate around 550 to 750 million per annum, with some additional infrastructure costs for things like depots and fleet and stops on top of that. On to the next of our recommendations, focusing on other parts of regional Victoria, outside Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo, is run more bus and coach services. Many people outside our major cities are very heavily reliant on their car. That is because public transport often fails to meet the destinations they need to go to. For example, 90% of young people in rural and regional Victoria can't access a TAFE or university by public transport. So you can see on the map on the right the places and routes that we're calling on the government to upgrade across the regional network there. They are focused on places that have access, that have jobs, education, healthcare and other services. On the towns, we're calling for buses to run every 30 minutes in the larger cities, such as Shepparton, Wodonga and Mildura, and in the smaller cities that are shown there every 60 minutes. Now that's quite a significant increase on what's there today. We're also calling for a longer span of those services, so later into the evening, starting earlier and running more on weekends. In terms of the coach network, there's some parts that are quite infrequent, and we highlight in our research that there's one of these routes where you actually only have 40 minutes between the only service of the day getting to its destination and coming back. So we're calling on these routes to have between 3 and 6 services in each direction each day to allow that sort of flexibility in travel to get people to where they need to at the times they need to go to. These sort of improvements can also go well when you coordinate them with train times as well, so those connections are minimised and you have an overall better network in there. It would cost about 25 to 45 million per year to operate these new services across regional Victoria, with some capital costs on top of that. The next one, continuing the bus theme I'll go to, is building a bus rapid transit network. This and the next 4 recommendations sort of focus on our middle, outer and growth area suburbs in terms of the growing demand in that part of the network, the lack of public transport services, and the growing congestion on both the public transport and road networks here. But this recommendation in particular focus on the area beyond the rail network and what we can provide there. Some reliable, fast services that get people to where they want to go. So what is a BRT network though? The BRT network is a series of routes that have dedicated lanes or alignments that they are not mixed in with other traffic. They run zero emission buses. They have high quality stops with good shelter, seating and real-time information. They're very frequent, 10 minutes or better throughout the day. We've done some analysis on how effective these are, and we get a return of about $2.20 for each dollar invested when we do these sort of services. We've prioritised 6 routes, which you can see on the map on the right there, including extending the Eastern Freeway busway that's currently under construction to go along Hoddle Street, which we know is a strong bottleneck, with some additional services, upgrades along the rest of the 907 route out through Doncaster. We also talked to, in our recommendation here, another 5 routes that could be done post this, but this is the areas where we think is the highest of priority for the network there. Each route again differs in length and therefore price, and each route costs between probably $200 and $900 million each, and the whole network of 6 routes would cost about $120 million a year to operate. Over into the rail network now with the next of our recommendations, which is extend metropolitan train services and run more services in Melbourne's West. Melbourne's West, you've either heard about it or experiencing some of the growth and the pains in this part of the network. This is why it's a key recommendation for us in the transport space to increase services in this part of the network. We're calling on the government to electrify the Melton line between Sunshine and Melton. That includes building 2 new tracks between Sunshine and Caroline Springs to create 4 tracks. That allows the V-line trains to run through that section separate from the metropolitan trains, allowing faster journey times for those commuters further out. We're also calling for more services on the Melton line. When you electrify that part of the network, you have some trains that would otherwise not be used, so we're calling for those to be allocated to the Wynnum line as a priority, but potentially other parts of the regional network as well. Knowing some of the limitations in access to the rail network, we're also calling for 2 new stations at Thornhill Park and Mount Atkinson to be built as part of the Melton electrification. We've undertaken an assessment of this, the Melton line works, and see that could return up to $1.70 for each dollar invested as well. Also in Melbourne's West, we've highlighted the need for a new station at Altona North with some rezoning of the land nearby. Altona North is one of the largest gaps in the metropolitan network between stations, but is also a metropolitan activity centre. So it both has access to residential and commercial areas that people can access. The next of our rail-related recommendations is in Melbourne's north, and we're calling on the government to upgrade infrastructure and run more services in that part of the network. This is one of those recommendations that, as Jonathan gave into the intro, we got a lot of feedback around and was included between our draft and finalised 30-year infrastructure strategy. There's quite a lot of outdated infrastructure on the Upfield line in particular that limits the amount of services that can run on that network. That limitations means that people along the line, including Coburg, Fawkner and Brunswick, often wait 4 to 5 times longer than some other parts of the network, particularly in Melbourne southeast. There's also an excellent opportunity for more housing to be built along this line, which is currently not there, primarily because some of those frequencies are limiting people's willingness to live in that area. So we're calling on the government to upgrade the infrastructure between North Melbourne and Upfield, including the signalling and power systems, duplicate the line between Gary and Upfield, as we show on the map there, and add a new station at Campbellfield, which accesses both residential and the employment precinct there. Also in Melbourne's north, but outside the Upfield line, we've called on the government to build a new railway station at Beveridge in the North Coast Corridor. By 2041, Beveridge is expected to have 75,000 people living there, but at the moment it's very constrained in both its public transport and road access. So providing a new station there caters for that growth, but also provides network redundancy. The next of the topics I'm going to talk about is not a recommendation, but as Jonathan pointed to earlier, one of our future options. So where we need to start a little bit later than some of the others as we prioritise the investment. And this is where we've got an option around extending train services into growth areas in the north of Melbourne and the southeast of Melbourne. There's still plenty of growth in these parts of the network. It's just not as strong or not as happening as urgently as some other parts. As part of this recommendation, we're calling on the Victorian Government to extend the Craigieburn line to at least Calcallo, connect up the Upfield line between Upfield and Roxburgh Park, and running Upfield line services through to Calcallo. That allows a bit more balancing of services on both of those lines, where at the moment there's a lot more services on the Craigieburn line than the Upfield line, just because of the population within each of those. In Melbourne southeast, we're also calling on the government to extend the Cranbourne line to Clyde and build 4 more stations as part of that. One of those stations would be at Dandenong South, and doing so would improve access to jobs, where 50,000 more jobs could be reached within 45 minutes by public transport if that was done. Around 15,000 people a day would use these 2 new extensions if they were built by the 2040s. On to our next recommendation, which is a bit away from infrastructure, but more around how to do things better. And this is make off-peak public transport cheaper and simplify the fare zones. So we know that providing the capacity at peak times is quite expensive. And if you can spread some of that demand, you can reduce the need for some of the infrastructure that's required. That includes getting people to shift who currently are in the peak to travel at off-peak times, but also encourage more people and drivers to car drivers to swap to public transport, as there's more services and it's cheaper for them to do so. It also benefits low-income earners who particularly travel at this time of day. We've also found this is quite an easy to understand part of fare reforms, noting that some people find the network quite complex. So this is why we've prioritised this over other types of fare reform. In regional Victoria, the regional fare cap has been quite a success, making those long distance trips a whole lot cheaper. But because of the fare zone, some of the shorter distance trips are still the same price. And a lot of people travel in regional Victoria only a short distance. So for example, if you caught a bus within Bendigo, the fares actually haven't changed in there. So some simplification of the fare zones makes some of those more local trips cheaper to have. And our final public transport recommendation is another one of our future options, which is reconfiguring the city loop for more frequent and reliable train services. We've just seen the opening of one of Melbourne's biggest rail infrastructure projects, the Melbourne Metro Tunnel. And some of the service uplift from that is still yet to come, particularly on the Craigieburn and Upfield lines. But over time, and as we go into the 2030s in particular, that the capacity to add more services becomes limited. So we need to look at what is the next project we need to do to allow the uplift of services there. So as you can see on the maps on the right, there's quite a bit of a bottleneck, particularly around North Melbourne, around that. And if we build some two new short tunnel extensions at North Melbourne and Richmond, we can allow the through running of services between the sort of north of Melbourne and the south and eastern suburbs. And that run through allows the separation of the Craigieburn and Upfield lines and allows for the running of more services on them. I'm now going to head over to our active transport recommendations. We've got two of those. And kicking off with the first one is around local streets, making those safer for children and communities. So there's been a fair bit of talk about this, both in the media and across industry, where we've recommended reducing speed limits in local streets where children often congregate. Those are schools, playgrounds, kindergartens and childcare centres. Why have we done that? Nearly 300 children a year in Victoria are seriously injured on the roads, and a lot of that happens on Victoria's local streets. We also know that research shows that when a pedestrian is hit by a car at 50 kilometres an hour, the chance of dying is 85%, but that drops down to 10% when the speed limit is only 30 kilometres an hour. So to see how safer streets perform in action, we've got a short video which we'll play to show what that looks like in practice.
You're running late and you see this, a new 30 kilometres an hour sign. Your first thought? Great, now I'll be even later. But the truth is, when you slow down, your travel time doesn't change that much.
Meet Remy and Sam.
They're driving the same route through local streets.
Remy thinks faster means quicker.
Sam just drives steady.
Remy races
To the first red light. Sam arrives right after, just as it turns green. Both stop for the school crossing, both give way at the roundabout.
Remy arrives just moments before Sam.
Here's why.
Your travel time isn't really about the speed limit.
On local streets, it's about traffic lights, busy roads, school crossings, parked cars and roundabouts. Australian research shows that slower speed limits on local streets have almost no impact on your travel time. But here's what does change.
A pedestrian hit by a car at 50 kilometres an hour has an 85% chance of dying.
At 30 kilometres an hour, that drops to just 10%.
And here in Australia, crashes are still a leading cause of death for children aged 1 to 14.
That's why Infrastructure Victoria
Recommends reducing speed limits in places where children spend time.
like schools, playgrounds and childcare centres. Your travel time is about the same, but kids get home safely.
Because some things matter more.
Lovely. And on to the final of our active transport recommendations, which is around cycling network and building safe cycling corridors in Melbourne and regional Victoria. If I can just get that slide moved over. Currently, about 60% of trips in Melbourne are under 5Ks in length. And that distance is perfect for cycling, not too short that you would otherwise walk and not too far that it wears you out or cars become more effective. Unfortunately, of those 60% of trips, only 2% are taken by bike. One of the key reasons for that is safety, and research from Monash University has shown that 75% of Victorians would be interested in cycling if they could, and it was safe to do so. Where it was separated from traffic, cars were separated from bikes. We've also found that those same separated bike lanes encourage more people to cycle. So we've recommended, as you can see on the map on the right, a whole series of protected cycling corridors across Melbourne, 12 of them, and across 4 in regional Victoria as well. We've selected those corridors based on underlying demand, estimates of demand, and the resultant benefits versus costs that we would see. Our research has shown that these corridors could deliver up to $4 of benefits to the community for each dollar invested, particularly if a network of those routes were provided there. That's all from me and the recommendations. I'm going to hand back to Jonathan to talk through the panel discussion and audience questions. Thanks, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. That was an absolute tour de force, of course, as you're taking us through those public transport and active transport recommendations. And for any of you who are watching who would like to rewatch that animated video about safer speeds on local streets, then you can find links to that on the IOB website or on YouTube as well. I'm biased, but I think it's definitely worth a rewatch. And feel free to share that on your socials as well. That's what it was designed for. So let's then start going to the questions that you've all been asking. And I'm certainly going to now bring in our guest panelists, Alison from Bicycle Network and Tony from PTUA. We've got some great questions that are coming through, and many of them relate to connecting Victorians more equitably and giving more travel choices beyond the inner city. And in relation to cycling, we've got a number of people who are describing to us, a big sort of donut-shaped gap between the inner city cycling networks and what's at the in the outer regions. And similarly with public transport, many people in the questions have been raising issues about the poor connectivity in middle and outer suburbs of Melbourne, and that public transport is not a competitive option compared to private car use. So, Alison, I'll start with you first. From your perspective, what are the priorities for us to close this gap in terms of more communities, particularly middle and outer communities, being well served with transport infrastructure and having greater travel choices and connections?
Yeah, and firstly, thank you for doing this incredible research and having some real evidence base to support implementing something like the strategic cycling corridor. And the people in the audience asking the questions are right. Like, Melbourne's infrastructure works in parts, but it's not yet fully connected. We have quite a strong inner city infrastructure and some outer growth investment, but there is a significant middle ring gap. And really, this is not just about the CBD, particularly this middle ring. It's about connecting your activity centres, your schools, your shops, those shorter trips that you're talking about, and that the research shows that 60% of those are less than 5 kilometres, which is really competitive for a bicycle to ride it quicker. So we really need to focus on filling those gaps, and your recommendations around firstly providing the strategic cycling corridor is a key recommendation to start actioning that. And then we need to address getting people to their doorstep, and measures such as the 30k kilometre speed limits really go a long way to make those local streets safer, so that people can get themselves from their house to the shops safely. And our members are asking for that. And if we see that, and if we do that, we will see a shift in the participation and an increase. But if there's gaps, that's where our issue lies.
Yeah, absolutely, Alison. Thanks. And Tony, let's go to you now with a sort of overarching question about how do we fill in those gaps in the network from a public transport perspective and give people more travel choices and more equitable opportunities as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I suppose the overarching thing here, as we see it, is that although we're obviously talking about infrastructure, as we know, physical infrastructure is never the full picture. What infrastructure does is it builds up systems that allow people to do things. So this is why, as Infrastructure Victoria, you actually do concern yourselves with things like speed limits in local streets, because it's all about the total system. A hospital is not just a building and a bunch of medical equipment. It's also about staff and logistics. And so when we look at the transport system, we're also want to see not just the physical tracks and roadways and that physical infrastructure, but the question always is going to be, how often do the trains run? Does there exist a bus route along this arterial road? And how often does it run? How late into the night does it keep running? And those are the very practical questions that determine whether we have an effective transport system or not. It's not just about the physical infrastructure. And so where we see gaps, it's, that there are physical infrastructure gaps, such as we've been talking about with rail in the western suburbs, with the extent of the tram network and where extensions are appropriate, say even to do things like just fill the gap between Burke Road and Glen Iris Station over half a kilometre, things like that we've known about for decades. But there are also gaps in service provision, and we look in, again, a lot of those western suburbs. There's been a chronic problem. We see it also in the north and the southeast, where there are now very large populations in these growth areas. There are some rail services, but there's often no effective way for people who live beyond walking distance from those new railway stations to actually access those without getting in a car. And we see the situation there that as soon as we find, cars are great things that really help us be mobile, but when you're faced with the prospect of your car being the only practical way to leave once you walk out your front door, it stops becoming this wonderful enabler of mobility and turns into, as some prominent urbanists have said, more like a very costly prosthetic device. We need to enable people to actually travel using the various means at their disposal, that they don't always want to be adding to traffic congestion every time they leave home. And so we need to ensure that those gaps are filled with appropriate service provision. And quite often that's just this very basic quotidian consideration of the local bus service and whether it runs every 10 minutes or whether it only runs once an hour like most of our services do. So I guess that's really the thing, Jonathan. When we look at infrastructure, we do need to look at the entire system.
Yeah, we would entirely agree with that, Tony, and hopefully that comes through with the breadth of recommendations that Matt's talked about. Staying with you, let's dive a little bit deeper into the bus network and what's it going to take for the bus network to be a viable choice for a lot of people. A lot of the questions that we're getting are around people saying, well, even on some major roads, they can't get a bus, or it's certainly not with a good frequency, or there's with a well-known problem of wandering bus routes that don't actually become fast and frequent and direct. In a practical sense, Tony, what do you think the changes are that need to be made in the bus network to make it a really viable option for people to use?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of questions here. Lots of very good detailed suggestions about improvements that we could make to the bus network. And I suppose to look at this strategically, it's good to really understand how we can have in place a planning process that would take all of this valuable input that comes from the community on bus services and actually work out what to do with our system, keeping in mind that every time there's a change in something like a local bus network, it's always not going to satisfy 100% of people. Some are going to experience a bit of downside as well, and we have to make sure that is appropriately limited and well explained, and that overall people still get a positive impression of what's happening. So I know that so nearly 20 years ago now, there was a very comprehensive process of bus reviews all over Melbourne that produced a lot of really useful documentation, a lot of suggestions from the public. There were detailed public forums that went into that. Not a lot of that has been implemented. Some of it has been done in a piecemeal way, but really there was not really the opportunity taken to carry that through. And that's where we possibly need a bit of reform in our planning processes to allow these things to more easily progress into the implementation stage. We almost saw that. So in the Brimbank Brimbank and Melton areas, Wyndham, I should say, there was another comprehensive bus review that was done by when for a while we had PTV working as a network planning agency and actually doing a lot of things about 15 years ago. There was a new network put in place almost from the ground up in the city of Wyndham and the city of Brimbank, and I suppose that did improve things like the directness of bus routes. They ran more in straight lines. There were fewer of these arbitrary zigzags, and there was an appropriate level of coverage. Buses didn't run along every single street, but at least you could see that the bus network did marry up with the major road network, and there was a logic to it. I suppose our main criticism of it at the time was that the services that were being provided were probably only about half as frequent as they really needed to be really useful to lots of people going about their day-to-day business. But frequency increases is just a matter of understanding how we can get a patronage dividend from these service improvements that do cost money, but when you have higher patronage, you have more economic activity, you have a bit of revenue coming back through the fare box, and this is all actually giving you a multiplier effect. And I think there's I think I would say that a body like Infrastructure Victoria is well placed to understand this. So when it comes to the bus network, yes, you can get great suggestions from the community, and there's lots of people who come forward with a lot of this input. But we need a process to coordinate that, have a planning process that actually is able to implement those changes in a way that doesn't produce this immediate community backlash that we have seen in other places. I know that Adelaide tried to do this and Brisbane tried to do this about 10 years ago, and things fell over because it was probably too much top down and not enough bottom up, really. So we need to make sure that these processes are well designed and thought through properly.
Yeah, so some very practical suggestions there, Tony, both about the nuts and bolts of better bus services, but also some of the strategies about how we achieve it in a way that's going to work as a network and is acceptable to people. And let's, Alison, turn to the similar kind of questions for the cycling network and how we build a cycling network that people actually want to use. There's questions coming through around the gaps that happen in the network. There are existing gaps, bike lanes that stop, gaps between sections of protected network. And we know from our research and that others have done that around 75% of people want to cycle, are certainly interested in cycling, but often don't feel safe to do so. And I think that's pretty consistent with work that Bicycle Network have done. Tell us a bit more about what does it take to get people on their bikes, people of all ages and abilities, and what are the key priorities in filling in some of these gaps?
Yeah, and you're spot on, and we hear it consistently that the majority of people are really interested in bike riding. I know myself, I ride a bike everywhere, and people are always saying, I'd really love to do that. And the but is, I'm concerned about my safety. And really providing that connected and safe infrastructure is the key. Often the funding is very opportunistic. So recently we've seen a great piece of infrastructure delivered with the Westgate Tunnel project. So of course it's on the back of a road project. We've seen 14 kilometres of bike paths delivered in the West that can now connect you incredibly from the CBD and going over that fabulous veloway, into the West. And that's wonderful. And things like that really create this mode shift. I've seen people out there with cobwebs on their bike, getting out there and enjoying the veloway, and people are really enjoying it. But the issue with this opportunistic way of funding is that then it does leave these gaps. So even using that example, we've had this incredible amount of infrastructure delivered. But one of the key gaps, particularly in Footscray, is getting from the Veloway to West Footscray Station, which there you can continue on through to Sunshine. And there's a lot of housing and a lot of people would commute to the shops into Footscray, etc. if that missing link was delivered. And there is an issue, because that alone will cause people not to get on their bikes. So I think it's about having a strategic view and delivering these corridors. That is a strategic cycling corridor that I'm talking about. And we really need to get the funding to do that. Other areas that will get people on their bikes too is making sure that there's amenities around. So when you get to the shops, you need a place to park your bike. You actually, when you go to the station, you need a place to park your bike. And there is parketeer cages throughout Victoria, and we'll disclose that Bicycle Network operate it, but then move on to public transport, because that's an efficient way. So you really need it to be integrated and safe, and separation is key. So when I talk about that Veloway, it's separated now from the dock, where there's a lot of truck traffic, there's a lot of unsafe situations and intersections because of that. This is removing the intersections, it's making a safe connected path, and that will create mode shift and getting to and from everywhere that you need to go to.
Yeah, absolutely. And what our modelling shows, as Matt was referring to before, is that when we do that, we can get tens of thousands of trips shifting from either private vehicle or public transport onto active transport, both short trips and some of those longer trips as well. But of course, not every section of an active transport journey, whether it's cycling or walking, is going to be on a protected cycleway. There's always going to be a start and end of a trip, nearly always. That's going to involve a road, and that's where some of the lower speed limits on local streets comes in. Alison, really be interested in your view. This was an area when we released this recommendation, it had a lot of attention, including quite a lot of media attention, and a lot of some very positive feedback from stakeholders actually on that recommendation. But how important are safer speeds on local streets for uptake of cycling?
Look, and this is, I concur totally. When we talk about 30-kilometre streets, it is really interesting people's reaction, because they think, oh, I won't get out of the second gear in my car. But it's not about that at all. We know, and that video clip is fantastic, and we have been sharing that 30K little clip that really goes to show it's about local streets where, the arterials move the vehicles, the intermediate roads and the arterials are the strategic cycling corridors, and then we need a way to get around the local streets. And 30-kilometre roads, which we're seeing across the world, the Netherlands, for example, are rolling it out. It's rolled out through Europe. It's actually the norm internationally now, really are the game changer for getting around those local streets. Because you're right, we have to be pragmatic. There won't be protected bike lanes on every single road, because that simply cannot happen. So we need to introduce measures such as these 30K streets to make it safe. And I think we've all experienced rat running and traffic going down local streets that genuinely doesn't need to be there. It's for local people, and it is a game changer. And there are examples in Victoria where this has been trialled, and the city of Yarra is the really great example, where I think one trial's been running since 2018, but before it was implemented, the neighbourhood wasn't quite sure. I don't think it was really popular, but now that those 30K streets have been rolled out and been rolled out for a significant time, their data shows that the residents there now would not like that to be reversed, and that they're seeing these positive impacts of slowing the streets down for the community. It's health, it's well-being, it's getting your kids travelling to school safely and actively. There's so many more benefits than just the transport efficiency. And I think that's where we need to really shift people's mindsets to say, it's not about slowing down your freeway. That's where the traffic should be. This is about community space and getting your kids and families around safely.
Yeah, and Matt, I might bring you into this part of the conversation while we're talking about safer speeds on local streets, and talked about the infrastructure that's involved in helping drivers to actually comply with those speed limits. Of course, we can stick a speed limit sign up, but there's more to it than that, isn't there, Matt? In terms of the infrastructure we need to have on local streets to actually help everybody comply with those speeds.
Yeah, there's a whole piece of work around that. If you design streets in a way that makes people feel that they only do slower speeds, it's a lot easier for them to do those local speeds and that sort of work there. And I guess part of this recommendation goes to when we build new streets, that we build in some of those features from the start, as well as potentially retrofitting that work as well. It's not necessarily a lot of change that needs to happen there. Things like, speed bumps and roundabouts and those sort of things can often slow people down incrementally. Pedestrian crossings and those sort of things can all make a difference in how people get around like that. Yeah, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Now, Alison was describing slower speed limits on local streets as being a game changer. The other game changer in this strategy is relation to bus rapid transit networks. That would be a game changer for Melbourne in our view. But Tony, I'd love to hear your view on the opportunities that bus rapid transit networks might have for Melbourne, and opportunities and challenges you see in its deployment.
Yeah, I think it goes back to how we how we make sure that there are those appropriate links in our transport network. There's plenty of opportunity, we see it, to make suburban rail work really well. But there are complementary ideas where you can put in the next level of bus infrastructure that actually makes things work in some of our suburbs. I suppose, again, from the point of view of a public transport user and someone who's looking to move around Melbourne and Victoria without using a car, is it's not always what things look like. It's again how they operate. It's how long you need to wait for something and how much time you spend going from place to place. Now, one nice thing about bus rapid transit is it does promise to speed up a lot of those journeys through the suburbs, there are many ways to do this. Dedicated grade separated infrastructure is one way that has you hope a superior outcome for travel times, but of course at quite a substantial cost. One other thing we can do to make our buses and also our trams act more rapid and just feel better as a user to have efficient journeys is actually making sure they have priority in our existing traffic system. So whenever we come to traffic lights at an intersection, we know that to move a tram or a bus that's got 100 people in it through an intersection only takes 5 seconds of a special phase in the traffic signals. To move the same number of people in cars, you need to have these long 60-second phases just to push that many cars through an intersection. We could make our traffic system work a lot more efficiently and build rapid transit into that again as an integrated system that's actually engineered for getting the most efficient modes of transport to actually behave efficiently. So lots of different infrastructure type solutions to make this work, and they all have different cost benefit equations to them as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and our cost benefit analysis on the bus rapid transit corridors that we've identified in the strategy and some of our previous research is really very promising, and it shows ways in which we can, connect many of these less well-serviced middle and outer suburbs to those trunk lines of rail corridors, but also places where you've got education and shopping and employment precincts that are currently underserved. So we'd certainly see it as being a game changer. And many of the questions and comments that are coming through, of course, are reflecting on that opportunity and the need to fill those gaps and maybe even for them to these networks be deployed in the future in some of our regional cities as well. So we're coming close to time. We've probably got time for just one more question for everybody. And shortly, for those of you who are viewing, you will see a poll come up in Slido that seeks your feedback on this webinar. We'd love to have your feedback. We're always looking to both improve our webinars and also think about what future topics should be. So that's your chance to have a say on that as we round out the last few minutes. And so Alison, Tony, Matt, let's talk a bit about how we take these strategic recommendations to changes on the street. We've touched on some of these in terms of especially bus reform and the cycling networks. From your perspective, what's the most important ways in which we can have multiple organisations advocating for change that turns these ideas into reality? Well, why don't we start with you, Alison?
Yeah, and you're spot on. We don't lack plans. The strategic cycling corridor was a subset of the principal bike network that's been around 30 years. So we know what we need to do. What we lack is consistent delivery and funding to deliver that. Without the funding, we're never going to get the strategic cycling corridor done. So we really need to prioritise that. We've got international standards. The UN recommends that 20% of infrastructure budgets should be invested in active travel. And we're seeing, in a recent meeting, we looked it up and we thought that it's less than 1%. It needs fact checking, but you can see the absolute gap there in funding. And without money, you simply can't deliver it. So we really welcome this research because we're actually working on the state government election at the moment, which is in November. And we're speaking to government and all candidates about delivering the strategic cycling corridor and getting the funding to do that. And we're working with community groups across the state, bicycle user groups. Our aim is to have one in every single electorate. So that's a big task, but also go out and speak to everybody as well about the importance of this and really delivering the hierarchy of active travel and movement and place and efficiency here in Victoria, because the funding isn't matching what our policy says. And we've just got to do it. We're seeing the results around the world. We're seeing Paris transform in 10 years. We've seen Amsterdam and we've seen other cities all around the world. Everyone's adopting it. It's just at what pace we're delivering it. And it just feels like we need to really get our skates on and to quote the old saying, we've got to put our money where our mouth is. And unfortunately, the funding just isn't matching at the moment. So we are excited to be working with so many community groups because they can tell the stories, the real life stories about how life-changing it is to be able to get from the shops to the school to your home locally, and what a great impact that has on the community. We don't want to see a line of cars out the front of schools. We want to see kids cycling, walking, scooting, skating to school like they did in the past and setting up their healthy habits so that their life is better from health outcomes, economic outcomes, and many other environmental outcomes, etc. So that's our number one pledge this year, that we want to try and increase the funding to get these cycling corridors delivered.
Thanks, Alison. And Tony, what's your perspective on this? How can we get communities and advocates and governments working together to make these strategic recommendations a reality?
So very, very quickly, because we're up to time, but I think we don't have a problem in Victoria producing planning documents in isolation. What we have a problem with is actually coalescing that into a a focused integrated transport plan that people can see ties in with other objectives, and especially housing, a big topic at the moment, but also a pathway to implementation of that plan. And that implementation needs to be guided by appropriate agencies who are in touch with all the stakeholder groups and are in touch with local communities as well. That there is, we know we always see a lot of conflict between local communities who are concerned about change, but also want change that they see as the right kind of thing for their community, to build up the linkages between those communities and the agencies who have the funding and the plans to make change happen, and ensure that that's done in a way that is that's seen to be achieving our goals, and is seen to be achieving our goals by virtue of the fact that there is a plan in place. So we have lots and lots of documents, but not necessarily a plan and not necessarily implementation. So it's that kind of process that probably needs to be looked at more closely, I'd say.
Thanks, Tony. And as you mentioned, one of the really big other hot topics around is housing and planning. And so the next of our webinars later in March is going to be focusing in on the recommendations that the strategy has on housing and planning. And I'm going to have some special guests coming along for that one as well, who I'm sure will seek to be as amazing as you, Alison, and Tony and Matt. So I really want to thank you today for your contributions as we've been developing this strategy, but also for your commentary and involvement in today's webinar. Very much appreciate it. Matt, as always, thank you so much for your contribution to the webinar and all the work you've done, with including many of people who are tuning in today to this webinar. So thank you all for joining us today. There will be a copy of this webinar available online for people to rewatch and share shortly. And I hope to see you either at a future webinar or another Infrastructure Victoria event in future. In the meantime, have a great day and bye for now.